So the gospel printed for today is not actually the gospel for today. So I am going to read it before I begin. At the Last Supper, when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord. Okay then. So as many of you know, it's also our custom here at the Cathedral just to do one reading prior to the Gospel. And today's reading from the book of Acts is a doozy. I'll come back to that. But I also want to reflect today on the reading we didn't read from the book of Revelation. So this is the morning of confusing readings. From Revelation 21 verses 1 to 6, we read, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. The Most High will dwell with them as their God. They will be God's peoples, and God's own self will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.' And the one who was seated on the throne said, 'See, I am making all things new.'" A new heaven and a new earth. I'm going to sidestep all the controversies around a literal apocalypse and the claims of some Christians that the rapture is right around the corner. I'm not going to go into that so much right now, but we do live in very turbulent times, and certain apocalyptic-minded Christian sects have seen signs of the end of times in every generation, not just our own. And in Jesus' own day, many, perhaps even including himself, believed it was imminent. So that's not where I want to go this morning with this passage. Instead, I want to begin this morning by asking you, think about this. If tomorrow we woke up and discovered that we were living in a new heaven and a new earth, what would you imagine it to look like? What would you want it to look like? With or without a second coming of Jesus to sweep the current world away, what would a world look like where every tear is wiped away, death would have no sting, and there would be no more mourning and crying and pain? Give that a moment to think about. What would that look like for you? So if you have some thoughts maybe, or a picture in your mind about what the world would be like when the Holy One would truly make all things new and we could plainly see it, what's in your mind? I can share what my own desiderata would be. I would like to see a world where nations would not prey on nations. In fact, maybe there would be no more borders at all. Just a celebration of the many beautiful cultures all around the world, sharing and seeing different peoples and traditions and religions through those others' own eyes, seeing as we might imagine God sees, with equal love and compassion and care for all. I would passionately like to see a world without racism, without gun violence, and again, mass shootings are in the news, without all forms of hatred and xenophobia and fear of the other that leads to hate. And bringing it closer to some of the anguish that saturates today's news, I would passionately like to see a world in which men, women, and all genders would have equal rights. And yes, I'm going to go there. A world in which abortion is, as the saying at least used to go, safe, legal, and rare. Rare because the entire infrastructure of the world's economies would support people not only at the time of prohibiting the end of a pregnancy, but an infrastructure ensured to support all children, all families, with living wages, adequate childcare, abundant food and safe housing, good health care across the whole lifespan, and hold up the right of women to remain in control of their own health, their sexuality, and their own bodies, including their own right to life. At a time when these rights are being directly and imminently threatened, we might remember that one of the core values of the Episcopal Church is the respect for individual conscience. This means that you and I may differ on how we think ethically and morally about abortion, but the consensus view of the Episcopal Church over many years can be a good guide. The published view of the Episcopal Church is that, quote, "We emphatically oppose abortion as a means of birth control, family planning, sex selection, or any reason of mere convenience." At the same time, since 1967, the Episcopal Church has maintained its, quote, "unequivocal opposition to any legislation on the part of the national or state governments which would abridge or deny the right of individuals to reach informed decisions about the termination of pregnancy and to act upon them." Just 4 years ago at the General Convention, the Episcopal Church called for, quote, "women's reproductive health and reproductive health procedures to be treated as all other medical procedures." The convention declared that equitable access to women's health care, including women's reproductive health care, is an integral part of a woman's struggle to assert her dignity and worth as a human being. Now, this issue is front and center right now as we all wait with bated breath, no matter what our personal moral view, for the Supreme Court's decision on cases that could overturn almost 50 years of settled law broadly protecting reproductive rights. But this issue can't really be taken in isolation from every other source of inequity and pain that we face in America and in our world today. Lack of access to resources, lack of a safety net, lack of gender equality, lack of racial justice, all of these are intertwined. In my own longing for a new heaven and a new earth, they are inseparable. I long for that day when all forms of mourning and crying and pain will be no more, because there will be no more inequality, no more wars, no more hate. Christians have been awaiting this promised day for 2 millennia now, and the historical evidence doesn't seem to point to humanity ever resolving any of these perils we face. And now, in addition, the peril of climate crisis threatens the end of this planet, not as a glorious new earth, but a scene of chaos, scarcity, and utter destruction. But Christian hope is something other than naive optimism. Do we dare to hope for a new heaven and earth, a new Jerusalem, even against all human odds? Do we dare to put our trust in a God who loves all creation so much that the Holy One will empower us to co-create with God that new heaven and earth that the book of Revelation foretells? Once we envision the new heaven and earth we passionately long for, and I can't help but believe that beyond all the specifics, we really ultimately long for the same things: good health and safety, beauty, truthfulness, and communities of equality and care in which to raise our children. Once we envision the new heaven and new earth, this begs the question, what would have to change in order for us to see it happen? And for that, I think we can turn to today's gospel. Jesus says at the Last Supper, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." Okay, so that's kind of squishy. We could all put different interpretations on love. But what did Jesus, the Jesus of John's gospel, where love is spoken of so often, actually mean by love? And what does Jesus mean when he says, "Just as I have loved you"? This is not some vague, fuzzy, warm ball of nice that Jesus is talking about. Remember, toward the beginning of John's gospel, and also in Matthew and Mark, so this must be one of the stories about Jesus that really stuck. Jesus made a whip out of the various pieces of hay and straw lying about from the cattle stalls and chased the moneylenders out of the temple. Not because they were providing a local money exchange per se, so don't worry if you need to change your dollars into some euros or pesos. Not because money itself is evil, but because it was a form of gouging people and fattening the temple hierarchy. Jesus was passionate in his desire for the new heaven and earth, and he came to proclaim that the kingdom of heaven was already among them if they would just see it. His was a tough love that demanded justice, real justice that went to the heart and intent behind the law, which was always justice from the very origins of the Jewish people. I had the opportunity to co-lead a class this past January with my rabbi chaplain friend Michal Springer, with equal numbers of students from Union Theological Seminary and Jewish Theological Seminary across the street. And what really came home to me, reading texts by Jewish scholars that I hadn't read previously, was how really Jewish Jesus was. Jesus, as he said in the Gospel of Matthew, did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. "I have come," he said, "not to abolish, but to fulfill." It wasn't the Jews he was against, he was one. It was those hypocrites who adhered to the letter of the law but continued all kinds of unjust practices that he opposed. The core of the law, which Jesus wholeheartedly embraced, was long established in the book of Leviticus. The love of neighbor, the love of the sojourner and the stranger, and Jesus interpreted this even as the love of enemy. So in Peter's vision in the book of Acts we read this morning, Peter protests against eating these weird sheetfuls of foods that for observant Jews then and now would be viewed with disgust as treif, unclean, while the Gentiles of that time might willingly gobble them down. The point of this passage in Acts was to convince observant Jews within the Jesus-following corner of Judaism, and remember that all Christians for several centuries were still regarded as a sect within Judaism, not a part of it, not apart from it. To convince these Jewish followers of Jesus that non-Jews could be Christian too. Jesus himself observed the law, but his guiding principle within and not apart from the law was that equity was at the heart of the law. Certain specifics could be overruled in favor of the larger Jewish principle of justice for all. So the Greek word for love in our gospel passage today is one of the many Greek words that gets translated into English just as love, as many of you already well know. The word here is agape, not eros, romantic or sexual love, not philia, brotherly love, but self-giving, impartial, today we might say unconditional love. This is the kind of love with which God loves all creation. And that is the kind of love that Jesus says he loved the disciples. We could call it parental, but it is even more than that. It's the love that deeply desires the good of the other without any qualification and without any differentiation between one person, one creature, and another. In other words, this agape love depends on a prior commitment to justice, where no one has an unequal share in the abundant goodness of God's creation. The gospel can be boiled down really to just one sentence, which presupposes the justice the Jewish Jesus was committed to. God loves everyone without exception. God loves everyone without exception. That's pretty radical, and we may not perhaps be able to love everyone equally ourselves, but God does. In the end, in the fulfillment of time, that is what a new heaven and a new earth will look like, that we will love as God loves. And because we will know and do justice as the expression of that agape love, God will dwell among us, and mourning and crying and pain will be no more. As you and I envision the new heaven and new earth we long to see, how will each of us take a step, one step today, toward loving without exception as God loves? Amen.